In 2013, wedged between two limestone blocks at the mouth of a cave on the Red Sea coast, archaeologists pulled a roll of papyrus from the sand. It had been there for 4,500 years. When they unrolled it, carefully, so carefully, it turned out to be a logbook, a work diary, written by a man named Mera. He was an inspector, a middle-ranking official whose immediate crew, or file, numbered about 40 men, though the broader team he belonged to comprised perhaps 200 workers, and his job, in the 26th year of the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, was to load limestone blocks onto a boat at the quarries of Tura, sail them across the water, and deliver them to a construction site. The construction site was the Great Pyramid. That papyrus is the oldest inscribed document ever found in Egypt, and it describes, in calm clerical detail, day by day, trip by trip, how stones were moved by water to the most famous building on earth. Mera notes the departure, notes the arrival, notes the overnight stay, notes the return, over and over for months the same quiet rhythm: load the stone, sail down river, unload, sail back. But here is the part that didn't make sense. There is no river at Giza, not anymore. The Nile flows several miles to the east. The pyramids sit on a barren strip of desert, far from any navigable water, and yet Mera's logbook is very clear. He sailed there. He docked. He unloaded stone at the foot of the plateau. For 11 years, that contradiction sat in the research like a splinter. Then, in May of 2024, a team of scientists led by Professor Iman Ghonim at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, published a paper in Communications, Earth and Environment, a peer-reviewed journal by the Nature Publishing Group. Using radar satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and deep soil core analysis, they found what Mera already knew. There was a river, a 64-kilometre branch of the Nile buried beneath farmland and desert sand, running directly alongside 31 pyramids, connecting every major pyramid field from Giza to Lisht. They called it the Ahramat branch. In Arabic, Ahramat means pyramids. Tonight, you are going to follow that river, from its discovery in a satellite control room, back through time to the years when it carried limestone and granite past the greatest construction sites the ancient world ever knew. You're going to walk along its banks and stand in its harbours and watch the water that made the pyramids possible. But you don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to sit up. You don't need to remember any of this in the morning. Just close your eyes. Let the desert get quiet. Let the river come back. It has been waiting. You've probably seen the pyramids from the air, in photographs, in documentaries, in that particular drone footage that every channel uses, and you have probably noticed, without ever quite thinking about it, something strange. The pyramids do not spread across the desert randomly. They cluster. They line up in a narrow band, running roughly north to south, along the western edge of the Nile floodplain. Giza, then Abu Rawash, then Zawiet El Aryan, then Abu Sir, then Saqqara, then Dashur, then Meidum, and eventually Lisht, a chain of monumental building that stretches across nearly 1,000 years and 64 kilometres of desert. Dozens of pyramids, some enormous, some crumbled, some barely recognisable, but all of them aligned along the same narrow corridor, as if following an invisible path. This has been one of Egyptology's quieter mysteries. Not the kind that makes headlines, not the kind that inspires cable television specials. Just a persistent, nagging architectural question. Why here? The obvious answer, the one most textbooks offer, is that the pyramids are near the Nile because the Nile was Egypt's highway. Water meant transport, transport meant logistics, and logistics meant that you could, in theory, move 2.5-ton blocks of limestone from the quarries at Tura on the east bank to the construction sites on the west bank. But the modern Nile is several miles east of the pyramid fields. At Giza, the distance is roughly 8 kilometres. Imagine dragging a stone block that weighs as much as a small car across 8 kilometres of sand and rocky terrain, using ropes and wooden sledges under the North African sun. Now imagine doing that 2 million times. The math never quite worked. There were theories, of course. There are always theories. Ramps, sledges over wet sand, internal spiralling passages, human-powered rollers. Each theory solved part of the problem and left the rest unexplained. The ramps would have required almost as much material as the pyramid itself. The wet sand technique, demonstrated in a 2014 study by researchers at the University of Amsterdam, could halve the required pulling force, but still assumed a relatively short distance between quarry and site. And then, There was the granite. The limestone for the core of the Great Pyramid came from quarries nearby, some of it from the plateau itself, but the granite beams in the King's Chamber, some weighing up to 80 tons, came from Aswan. Aswan is roughly 900 kilometres to the south by river. No sledge could cover that distance. No ramp could carry that weight. Granite means water. It always did. The ancient Egyptians moved granite by loading it onto barges and floating it downriver. That much is not controversial. Relief carvings from the 5th dynasty tomb of Ti at Saqqara show cargo boats carrying enormous stone blocks. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest historical records in Egypt, mentions Pharaoh Sneferu, Khufu's father, importing 40 ships filled with cedar logs from Lebanon for shipbuilding. These were not a primitive people improvising with sticks and rope. They were sophisticated logisticians with a deep understanding of water transport. But if the granite came by water, and the fine Tura limestone came by water, and the workers and their food came by water, then there had to be water at Giza, close to Giza, not 8 kilometres away. Close enough to dock a barge, unload a stone, and roll it up a causeway to the building site. And that is exactly what Inspector Mera described in his logbook. A waterway, a harbour, a place called Shi Khufu, the Lake of Khufu, where boats arrived and cargo was unloaded at the base of the plateau. For decades, archaeologists suspected that some kind of waterway had once existed near the pyramid fields. Mark Lehner, the American Egyptologist who has directed excavations at Giza for more than 30 years through the organisation Ancient Egypt Research Associates, found sediment evidence of a harbour basin east of the Sphinx. Borehole cores from the Giza floodplain showed layers of Nile silt and clay at depths consistent with a former river channel. The valley temples at the base of each pyramid complex, those massive stone structures with elaborate quays and smooth floors, looked to trained eyes less like temples and more like docks. But no one had mapped the river. No one had traced its full course. No one had proven, with the kind of evidence that could survive peer review, that a single continuous waterway once connected all 31 pyramid sites, until Eamon Ghanem looked at the desert from space. Eamon Ghanem grew up in Egypt. She studied the land, she walked the sites, and she carried with her for years the same quiet question that so many others had carried before. Why are the pyramids where they are? It is a simple question. Simple questions are often the most dangerous. By the time Ghanem took up the investigation formally, she was a professor of earth and ocean sciences at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, a geomorphologist, someone who studies the way landscapes change over time. Her co-principal investigators were Suzanne Onstein of the University of Memphis, a specialist in ancient Egyptian texts, and Timothy Ralph of Macquarie University in Australia, a specialist in river systems. The project was funded by the National Science Foundation. Their approach was, in a certain way, counterintuitive. They did not start with the pyramids, they started with the desert itself. The tool they used first was radar satellite imagery. Unlike optical satellite images, which show what the surface looks like, radar penetrates the ground. It sends microwave pulses downward and records what bounces back. Different materials, sand, clay, silt, bedrock, return different signals. A buried river channel filled with fine sediment looks different from the surrounding desert substrate on a radar scan. It creates a signature, a ghost, and that is exactly what Ghanem's team found. Running along the foothills of the western desert plateau, at the very edge of the Nile floodplain, there was a long, continuous subsurface feature. A linear anomaly that stretched for 64 kilometres, invisible to the naked eye, invisible to any camera but unmistakable on radar. It was the shape of a river. To confirm what the satellite suggested, the team moved to ground-penetrating radar, a more localised technique that sends electromagnetic pulses into the soil from a device dragged across the surface. The results matched. Beneath the farmland and sand, the subsurface profile showed the characteristic signature of a former river channel, layers of fine sandy sediment, deposited in the patterns that flowing water creates. Not windblown sand, not geological strata, river sediment. Then came the deep soil cores. Drilling equipment was brought to multiple sites along the proposed course of the buried waterway. At each location, the team extracted long cylinders of earth from depths of approximately 25 metres. The cores revealed sandy sediment consistent with an active river channel, along with ancient aquatic plant pollen. the fossilized remains of organisms that could only have lived in flowing water. 3 independent methods, 3 consistent results. Satellite radar showed the shape. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the subsurface structure. Soil cores delivered the biological and sedimentary proof. The river was real. Ghanim's team named it the Ahramat branch, the Pyramid branch, and when they published their findings in May of 2024, the paper landed with the quiet force of something that changes a field. Not because the idea was new. Archaeologists had suspected a Western Nile branch for decades, but because the evidence was finally definitive. The Ahramat branch had been 200 to 700 metres wide, 2 to 8 metres deep, large enough to accommodate the heavy cargo barges of the Old Kingdom, large enough to carry stone, and it ran directly past every major pyramid in Egypt. Let yourself imagine this. You are standing at the base of Khafra's Valley Temple at Giza. It is about 2540 BC. The temple is new. Its walls are clad in massive blocks of polished granite from Aswan, red and grey, fitted together so precisely that you could not slide a reed between them. The floor is smooth, the air smells of river water and bitumen and the particular chalky dust of freshly cut limestone. Behind you, the causeway rises, a long walled corridor ascending the plateau at a gentle angle, running from the temple up to the mortuary temple and then to the pyramid itself. You have seen these causeways in photographs, long rubble-strewn pathways, exposed to the sky, leading from the desert floor to the monuments above. But that is not what they looked like when they were new. When they were new, they were covered, enclosed. The walls were decorated with painted relief carvings. The ceiling was pierced at intervals to let in shafts of light. They were not roads. They were processional corridors, sacred passages. And at the bottom of each causeway, at the river end, was a valley temple, a harbour. This is the detail that Ghanim's study made legible for the first time. When you map the course of the Ahramat branch and then overlay the positions of the 31 pyramids in the study area, a pattern emerges that is almost too clean to be coincidence. Nearly every pyramid has a causeway. Nearly every causeway runs perpendicular to the river, and nearly every causeway terminates at a valley temple that sits directly on the proposed bank of the Ahramat branch. 31 pyramids along the same buried river, and many of them, based on the surviving evidence, with causeways pointing directly at it. The valley temples were not, as was sometimes assumed, primarily ceremonial structures, or rather they were ceremonial, but their ceremony was inseparable from their function. They were the places where the river met the monument, the interface between water and stone. Boats arrived here, stone was unloaded here, workers and priests and officials came ashore here, and later, when the pharaoh died, his body was brought here by barge to begin its final journey up the causeway to the tomb. At Giza, the configuration is particularly clear. Ghanim's team identified a feature they called the Giza Inlet, a secondary channel branching west from the Ahramat branch and running directly to the base of the plateau. The causeways of all 4 Giza pyramids, the 3 Great Pyramids and the subsidiary pyramid of Queen Khentkawes, lead down to this inlet. Their valley temples sit alongside it, facing the water. Think about what this means. The pyramids at Giza were not built on the edge of a desert. They were built on the edge of a harbour. The valley temples were docks, the causeways were loading ramps, and the Ahramat branch was the highway that connected the quarries, the workforce and the building sites into a single integrated logistics network. The desert came later. The silence came later. The isolation and the mystery and the impossibility. All of it came later. In the beginning, there was water. Now you know the river existed. Now follow a stone. It is the 26th year of Khufu's reign. The pyramid is nearing completion. Most of the core masonry, the roughly cut local limestone that makes up the bulk of the structure, has already been quarried from the plateau itself. What remains is the outer casing, a skin of fine, white Tura limestone that will make the pyramid gleam in the desert sun like a mirror. The Tura quarries are on the eastern bank of the Nile near modern Cairo. The stone is beautiful, pale, fine-grained, almost luminous when freshly cut. It has been used for royal architecture since the earliest dynasties, but it is heavy. Each block of Tura limestone destined for the pyramid weighs roughly 2 to 3 tons. Inspector Mera's team arrives at the Tura quarry complex. There are 2 working sections, Tura North and Tura South, and Mera's team alternates between them on a roughly 10-day cycle, giving the quarry workers time to cut and stack fresh blocks between visits. The quarry workers have already done their part. The blocks are stacked and waiting. Loading begins. The blocks are rolled or levered onto the waiting barge using ramps. Mera's logbook suggests his team made the round trip, Tura to Giza and back, in about 4 days. 2 or 3 trips every 10 days, perhaps 30 blocks per voyage. The barge casts off from Tura in the morning. It enters the river, the Nile proper, and turns north, carried by the current. The wind in Egypt blows predominantly from the north, which means that sailing upstream requires a sail, but sailing downstream requires only the current. Mera's team is heading downstream, north, toward Giza. But they don't stay on the main Nile. At some point the barge turns west, entering the Ahramat branch, or more precisely the network of channels and basins that connect the Nile to the Giza plateau. Mera's logbook mentions several waterways, the Shikufu, or Lake of Khufu, and the Rosh Khufu, the mouth of the Lake of Khufu. These names correspond to what Mark Lehner's decades of excavation have revealed, a system of artificial basins and canals cut into the floodplain, designed to bring boats directly to the foot of the plateau. Lehner's borehole cores from the area east of the Great Sphinx show Nile silt and clay at depths of 2 to 5 meters above sea level, confirming that water once flowed through this area. The basin he identified measures roughly a quarter mile by a third of a mile, dredged he estimates to a depth of 26 to 33 feet, enough clearance for heavily laden cargo barges. Mera's barge enters this basin. Around him, other boats are docked, dozens, perhaps hundreds, from all over Egypt. Granite barges from Aswan, timber boats from Lebanon, carrying the cedar logs that the Egyptians used for scaffolding and for building the boats themselves. Supply vessels from the Nile Delta, loaded with bread and beer and cattle to feed the workforce. The basin is a construction port, a living, noisy, essential piece of industrial infrastructure. The blocks are unloaded, probably rolled down ramps from the barge onto the prepared surface of the harbour area. From there they are moved along the causeway, possibly on sledges, possibly on wooden rollers, up the gentle incline to the pyramid. Mera notes the overnight stay, notes the departure. He sails back to Tura, loads another shipment, returns, loads, returns. The logbook records months of this rhythm. The same route, the same stones, the same quiet labour. What Mera could not know, what no one in the 26th year of Khufu's reign could have imagined, was that the water beneath his hull would one day vanish, that the river he sailed on, this essential artery of civilization, would silt up and disappear, buried so deeply that it would take radar pulses from space to find it again. Mera finished his work. The papyrus was stored at the harbour complex of Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, tucked between limestone blocks at the entrance to a storage gallery. The harbour was closed, probably upon Khufu's death. The papyrus sat in the dry desert air for 4,500 years. It was found in 2013 by Pierre Tallet, an Egyptologist from the University of Paris-Sorbonne, and Gregory Mahuar. The very first batch of fragments was pulled from the sand on March 24th of that year. The second and largest set was found 10 days later. When Tallet realised what they were, the oldest inscribed papyri in the history of Egypt, a direct eyewitness account of pyramid construction, the discovery was, in the quiet words of Zahi Hawass, former Minister of Antiquities, the greatest discovery in Egypt in the 21st century. And yet, for 11 years, the most important implication of Mera's diary remained unproven. He described sailing to Giza. He described a waterway. He described a harbour. But no one had found the river until Ghanim. You need to understand something about rivers, and about the Nile in particular, to grasp what happened to the Ahramat branch. A river is not a fixed thing. It is not a line drawn on the earth. It is a negotiation between water and gravity, between sediment and slope, between rain in distant mountains and the slow tectonic settling of the land beneath. A river moves. Over centuries, over millennia, it shifts. It widens and narrows, splits and recombines, carves new channels and abandons old ones. The Nile has been doing this for millions of years. In the ancient delta region alone, historical sources record at least 7 distinct branches: the Pelusiac, the Tanatic, the Mendesian, the Phatnitic, the Sebennytic, the Bulbatine, and the Canopic, most of which no longer exist. The Greek geographer Ptolemy mapped them in the 2nd century AD. By the medieval period, 5 of those 7 had silted up and disappeared. Today, only 2 survive, the Rosetta and the Damietta. The Ahrimat branch was an upstream version of this same process. During the Old Kingdom, roughly 2700 to 2200 BC, the Nile's discharge was significantly higher than it is today. Monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands were stronger. More water flowed into the system. The river spread wider, pushed harder, and sustained more branches. The western desert plateau, which today sits dry and uninhabitable, was bordered by a living waterway, broad enough to carry cargo, deep enough for heavy barges, permanent enough to build a civilization around. The pyramid builders did not choose to build in the desert. They chose to build on a riverbank. But rivers do not stay where you put them, and the Ahrimat branch was no exception. To understand why it died, you have to look beyond Egypt. You have to look at the whole world. Approximately 4,200 years ago, around 2200 BC, something happened to the climate of the Earth. It did not happen suddenly, the way a storm arrives. It arrived slowly, like a tide going out. Rainfall patterns shifted, monsoons weakened. The air grew drier across a band of the planet that stretched from the Mediterranean to South Asia. Lakes shrank, rivers thinned, dust accumulated. Climate scientists call this the 4.2 kiloyear event, 4,200 years before present. It is one of the most severe arid episodes of the Holocene, the geological era in which all of recorded human civilization has occurred, and it is now recognized as so significant that the International Commission on Stratigraphy uses it to mark the beginning of the current Megalaean age, the most recent subdivision of the Holocene epoch. The evidence comes from many sources. Fossilized pollen from Nile delta cores shows a dramatic decline in marsh and wetland species around 2200 BC. Speleothems, mineral deposits in caves, record shifts in oxygen isotope ratios consistent with prolonged drought. Fossil corals from Oman suggest that intense winter chamal winds around this same period led to the salinization of irrigated fields across Mesopotamia. Ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia to the Horn of Africa, all record the same signal, a world drying out, and with it, civilizations collapsed. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire, the second great empire in human history, founded by Sargon of Akkad, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, disintegrated. Archaeological evidence from Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, excavated by Harvey Weiss of Yale University, shows that the city was suddenly abandoned around 2170 BC. Drought-resistant cattle breeds appear in the fossil record for the first time. A wall called the Repeller of the Amorites was built across central Mesopotamia to stop climate refugees from pouring south. The Akkadian state fragmented, invaded by the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, and by 2150 BC, the empire was gone. In the Indus Valley, the great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa began to decline. Urban populations dispersed. The Gaga-Hakra river system, which had sustained the civilization, dried up as monsoon patterns shifted. By 1900 BC, the sophisticated urban culture of the Indus Valley had transformed into something smaller, simpler, more rural. In China, the Liangzhu culture of the lower Yangtze River area, famous for its jade artifacts and advanced hydraulic engineering, collapsed around the same period, and in Egypt, the Old Kingdom ended. The Old Kingdom, the era of pyramid building, is traditionally dated from about 2686 to 2181 BC. The Sixth Dynasty, its last, was marked by the long reign of Pepi II, who is sometimes said to have ruled for 94 years. By the end of his reign, the central government had weakened. Regional governors, the nomarchs, had accumulated independent power. But the underlying cause was not political, it was environmental. The Nile's discharge dropped. The annual inundation, which Egyptian civilization depended on for agriculture, became unpredictable. Famine spread. An inscription from the tomb of Ankh-Tifi, a provincial governor during the first intermediate period that followed the Old Kingdom's collapse, describes the crisis. The south of Egypt starving, people eating their own children, the governor refusing to let anyone die of hunger, and redistributing grain from his own stores. This was the world the Ahrimat branch died in. As rainfall diminished in the Ethiopian highlands, less water entered the Nile system. Branches that had been sustainable during wetter centuries began to thin and retreat, At the same time, Ghonem's research suggests tectonic subsidence in northern Egypt tilted the landscape slightly eastward, redirecting water away from the western branch. And as the Sahara expanded, as the desert reasserted itself over land that had been semi-green during wetter millennia, wind-blown sand accumulated in the riverbed, silting, choking, filling. The Ahramat branch did not disappear in a season. It died over centuries, a slow withdrawal, the water level dropping year by year, the channel narrowing, the banks hardening, the marshlands along its edges drying to cracked earth. The pyramids built in the later dynasties along the Ahramat branch's course are smaller, more modest, less ambitious. The scholars who study them have noted this decline in scale, and now, perhaps, we can understand it differently. It was not just that later pharaohs had less power or less ambition. It was that they had less water. The logistics that made the Great Pyramid possible, the river highway, the cargo barges, the integrated supply chain, were literally evaporating beneath their feet. The last pyramids built along the Ahramat branch date to the 13th dynasty, around 1650 BC. By then, the river was effectively gone. The sand had won, and for the next 4,000 years no one knew it had ever been there. Let the desert go quiet for a moment. Feel the air cool around you. The story has reached a still point, and this is a good place to rest inside it. The Ahramat branch is not truly gone. That is the strange and haunting thing about what Ghonem's team found. The river is buried, yes, the water has left. But the sediment, the fine sandy silt that flowing water deposits over centuries, is still there, 25 metres down, still arranged in the patterns that a living river creates, still holding fossilised pollen from aquatic plants that bloomed 4,000 years ago. The river is a fossil now, a geological memory, and the land above it has no idea. If you stood at Giza today, at the spot where Mera once docked his barge, where blocks of Tura limestone were unloaded and rolled up the causeway, you would see farmland, fields, maybe a road, maybe the edge of a town. The Nile floodplain here is flat and fertile, irrigated by modern canals connected to the present-day Nile miles to the east. Nothing about the surface suggests that a major waterway once flowed beneath your feet. That is what makes Ghonem's work so remarkable. She did not excavate the river. She imaged it. She read the ground like a palimpsest, a manuscript where the original text has been scraped away and overwritten, but where the ghost of the first writing remains visible beneath the new. Radar sees through sand the way candlelight reveals old script on parchment. The instrument does not care what the surface looks like. It cares about what lies beneath. And beneath the fields and the roads and the desert that fill the Ahramat branch's former channel, the ghost of the river persists. This has implications that extend far beyond the pyramids. If a 64-kilometre river can be buried so completely that it escapes detection for 4 millennia, only found when someone aims a satellite at the desert with the right kind of radar, then what else is buried? The banks of the Ahramat branch were not empty. A river of that size, flowing through the heart of the most powerful civilization of its age, would have had settlements along its length. Harbours, granaries, temples, workers' villages, administrative centres, cemeteries, the full infrastructure of a society built around water. None of those structures have been excavated, most have not been located. They lie beneath the fields, beneath the towns, beneath the expanding suburbs of modern Egyptian cities that grow outward each year, swallowing the floodplain. Ghonem's team recognised this in their paper. They wrote that future research to identify more extinct Nile branches could help prioritise archaeological excavations along their banks, and that without this prioritisation, sites could be lost forever to urbanisation. The Nile is the longest river in the world, roughly 6,800 kilometres from its source in the East African highlands to its mouth at the Mediterranean. It has been flowing, in one form or another, for millions of years. Over that time it has shifted, branched, dried up, and reformed more times than any human record could capture. The present-day Nile, with its 2 main distributaries, the Rosetta and the Damietta, is only the most recent configuration of a river system that has been reinventing itself since the Miocene. The Ahramat branch is one chapter in that much longer geological story, and understanding it helps us see the pyramids not as isolated monuments, but as part of a living landscape that has been in constant slow motion for longer than human civilization has existed. The desert remembers. but the desert is being paved. Come back to the river in its prime. The Aramat branch is flowing. It is perhaps the 25th century BC, the height of the 4th dynasty, the golden age of pyramid building. Khufu's pyramid is finished, gleaming white against the blue desert sky. His son Khafra is building beside it, or perhaps he has already finished, and the Sphinx carved from the bedrock of the plateau guards the causeway with its inscrutable gaze. Menkora, the third great pyramid builder of Giza, is planning or constructing his own more modest monument. And at the foot of the plateau, where the causeway meets the water, the valley temples are busy. Valley temples are one of the most architecturally impressive and most misunderstood elements of the pyramid complex. They are not small. Khafra's Valley Temple at Giza is a massive structure, built from enormous blocks of limestone clad in red granite from Aswan. Its interior is a forest of polished pillars, its floors are smooth. Its walls are bare and severe, not because they were never decorated, but because granite resists the kind of carved relief that limestone invites. The effect is austere, powerful, functionally beautiful. For a long time, these temples were interpreted primarily as ceremonial spaces, places where rituals were performed during the pharaoh's funeral, where offerings were made, where the cult of the dead king was maintained by generations of priests. All of that is true, but it is not the whole truth. The valley temples were also, in all likelihood, ports. Yonim's study provides the strongest evidence yet for what the architecture had always implied. The 5 surviving valley temples in the study area all sit directly adjacent to the proposed banks of the Ahramat branch. They face the water. Their lower courses show what appear to be signs of waterline erosion. Some have features that could represent quays, flat reinforced stone surfaces at water level, consistent with structures designed to receive the hulls of boats. Imagine the scene. A barge arrives at the quay of Khafra's Valley Temple. It is carrying granite, perhaps a lintel for the temple interior, perhaps a statue base for one of the pharaoh's images. Workers guide it alongside the stone quay with ropes. It bumps gently against the dock. The cargo is unloaded, rolled onto wooden sledges and dragged up the causeway. And later, perhaps years later, the pharaoh himself arrives at this same quay. But now the boat carries his body, embalmed, wrapped, sealed in a coffin. The priests receive the body at the temple. The funeral begins. The procession moves up the causeway through the roofed corridor with its painted walls, past the mortuary temple to the pyramid. The Valley Temple was, in other words, the threshold, the point of transition between the world of the living, the river, the boats, the labour of daily life, and the world of the dead, the causeway, the tomb, the eternity of stone. And without the river, none of it makes sense. The causeways lead to nothing. The valley temples face empty desert. The entire architectural logic of the pyramid complex becomes incoherent. The Aramat branch does not just explain how the pyramids were built. It explains why they were designed the way they were. The story of the Aramat branch does not begin with Khufu. It begins earlier, possibly much earlier. The oldest pyramid in Egypt, the first monumental stone structure ever built, is the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. It was designed by Imhotep, the legendary architect, physician, and sage who was later deified by the ancient Egyptians and equated with Asclepius by the Greeks. The step pyramid dates to about 2670 BC, the beginning of the Third Dynasty. Saqqara sits directly on the proposed course of the Ahramat branch. The Great Necropolis, one of the largest and most important burial grounds in all of Egypt, containing tombs from every period of ancient Egyptian history, stretches along the western desert plateau overlooking the floodplain. It is precisely the kind of location you would expect a civilization to choose if it had a navigable river running below. The Ahramat branch, according to Ghanim's study, borders pyramids spanning from the 3rd dynasty to the 13th dynasty, roughly 1,000 years of construction, from approximately 2670 to 1650 BC. This means the river was not merely a feature of the 4th dynasty building boom at Giza. It was a persistent element of Egyptian infrastructure for the entire age of pyramid building. And the architecture evolved alongside the river. Early pyramids, Djoser's step pyramid, the experimental forms at Meidum and Dashur, show clear evidence of association with the riverbank, but their causeways and temple complexes are simpler. By the 4th dynasty, the system had been refined into the fully integrated pyramid complex. Pyramid, mortuary temple, causeway, valley temple, all oriented toward the water. This standardization suggests that by Khufu's time, the relationship between the river and the monument had been formalized. It was not just convenient, it was canonical, the way you built a pyramid. And as the river shifted, as its water level rose and fell with the centuries, the pyramid sites shifted too. Ghonem's team noted that the distance between the pyramids and the proposed riverbank varies over time. Earlier pyramids tend to sit closer to the river. Later pyramids are sometimes farther away, a pattern that could suggest the builders were adapting to a retreating waterline, though other factors, such as the availability of suitable bedrock or the political preferences of individual pharaohs, may also explain the variation. The water level in the Ahriman branch itself appears to have fluctuated. During the 4th dynasty, the branch seems to have been at its fullest, deep, wide, and fast-moving. By the 5th and 6th dynasties, based on the sedimentary evidence, the water level had begun to decline. The pyramids tell the story of the river, if you know how to read them. The grandest ones were built when the water was highest. The smaller ones came as the water fell. You might be wondering, did the ancient Egyptians simply find the Ahriman branch and build beside it, or did they shape it? The answer, almost certainly, is both. The ancient Egyptians were extraordinary hydraulic engineers. They did not merely live beside the Nile, they managed it. They built irrigation canals, dug retention basins, constructed dikes to control the annual flood, and created artificial waterways to extend the river's reach into otherwise dry land. At Giza, the evidence for active water management is particularly strong. Mira's logbook mentions several distinct waterways around the pyramid complex. The Rocher Khufu, the mouth of the Lake of Khufu, the She Khufu, the Lake of Khufu, and the Shiaket Khufu, the Lake of the Horizon of Khufu. These names suggest a system of interconnected basins and channels, not a single natural river, but a managed network. Mark Lehner's excavations support this interpretation. The harbour basin he identified east of the Sphinx, based on borehole core evidence, appears not to have been a natural lake. The evidence suggests it was dredged, cut deliberately into the floodplain sediment, deepened to accommodate heavy barges. Lehner has identified what appear to be colossal walls of basalt and limestone that formed its perimeter, engineered structures that, if his interpretation is correct, represent a massive investment of labour and planning. The Egyptians, in other words, did not just use the Ahriman branch, they improved it. They dug channels to connect the river to specific construction sites. They created artificial lakes to serve as staging areas. They built harbours and docks and quays. The Ahriman branch was the backbone, but the circulatory system that served the pyramid sites was partly human-made. This casts the pyramid building project in a different light. It was not merely a feat of stonemasonry, it was a feat of infrastructure. Before a single block could be quarried, cut, and placed, an entire logistics network had to be constructed. Canals, harbours, roads, bakeries, breweries, barracks, granaries, administrative buildings. The lost city of the pyramids, excavated by Lehner at Giza, covers an area that he estimates at 300 hectares, comparable in size to the first great cities of Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Uruk. The pyramids were not built by an army of labourers heaving stones through the desert. They were built by a state, organised, literate, well-fed, and supported by a water transport system of remarkable sophistication. And the Ahriman branch was the foundation of all of it. Now picture a different journey, longer, slower, more remarkable. You're in Aswan, roughly 900 kilometres south of Giza by river. The Nile here is narrower, faster, framed by cliffs of red granite. This is the stone that lines the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid. This is the stone of Khafra's Valley Temple. This is the stone that the ancient Egyptians prized above almost any other, not for its beauty, though it is beautiful, but for its hardness, its permanence, its defiance of time. Quarrying granite in the 26th century BC was slow, brutal work. The Aswan quarries still bear the marks. You can see half-finished obelisks, abandoned mid-cut, their outlines scored into the living rock with lines of small, regular holes where copper chisels and wooden wedges were driven in and soaked with water until the stone cracked along the intended line. The blocks destined for Giza, some weighing up to 80 tons, were cut, levered out of the quarry, dragged to the riverbank on rollers and sledges, and loaded onto barges, cedar barges, built from timber imported from the mountains of Lebanon, modern-day coastal Syria and Lebanon, because Egypt had almost no native timber suitable for large-scale shipbuilding. the Palermo stone records that Khufu's father, Sneferu, imported 40 shiploads of cedar for exactly this purpose. The resulting boats were flat-bottomed, shallow-drafted, and enormously strong. The Khufu ship, found dismantled in a sealed pit beside the Great Pyramid in 1954 by Kamal el-Malach, and painstakingly reassembled over more than a decade by master restorer Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, gives us a direct look at this technology. 43 metres long, nearly 6 metres wide, built from 1,224 pieces of Lebanese cedar, held together not by nails but by rope lashings and mortise and tenon joints. A masterpiece of woodcraft, now housed in the Grand Egyptian Museum. The cargo barge that carried granite from Aswan would have been less elegant but more robust. Flat-bottomed for stability, wide for capacity, designed to ride low in the water under the weight of stone. The journey from Aswan to Giza was a journey with the current, north, downstream, roughly 900 kilometres of river. It would have taken weeks, past Thebes, past Abydos, past the cliffs and floodplains and villages of Upper Egypt, through the narrowing valleys and past the broadening delta, and then, at last, into the Aramat branch, turning west, leaving the main Nile, entering the quieter, shallower waters of the Pyramid Highway. The barge docks at the Giza harbour basin. The granite is unloaded. It is dragged up the causeway. It is fitted into place, inside the pyramid, or in the temple walls, or on the floors of the sacred precinct, and the barge turns south again, riding the wind back to Aswan, to do it all over again. What would take 1,000 men on land could be accomplished by 40 men on water. That is the equation the Aramat branch made possible. Not miraculous, not alien, not impossible, just water and wood and the patient intelligence of a civilization that understood how to move the world by floating it. There is a story within the story. Beneath the logistics, beneath the engineering, beneath the movement of stone, there is a human story. Mera's logbook tells us more than how the pyramid was built. It tells us how the workers were organised. His team was a file, a work unit of about 40 men, which was itself part of a larger division called the escort team of __0__. The name refers to a boat. The uraeus, the sacred cobra, was a symbol of royal power. These were not slaves. They were organised, named, purpose-driven work teams, specialist crews with specific assignments, and they were fed. Mera's logbook includes accounting records alongside the daily work log. Bread, beer, meat, dates, grain. These were rationed according to rank. More for officials, less for labourers, but nobody went hungry. The 2014 excavations of the lost city of the pyramids at Giza, directed by Lena, confirmed this picture. The workers' bakeries could produce thousands of loaves a day. Their diet included beef, goat, and fish. They were given medical attention. Skeletons show healed fractures, evidence of care. They were not expendable. They were valued. Pierre Tallet, who discovered Mera's papyrus, has emphasized this point. The Red Sea Scrolls contradict the popular image of enslaved masses building the pyramids under whip and duress. What they reveal instead is a bureaucratic, organized, well-provisioned labor force, skilled workers who received compensation and who took pride in their assignments. And the Ahramat branch was the network that held this system together. The food came by river. The stone came by river. The workers, rotating in shifts from across Egypt, came by river. The administrative communications came by river. The river was not just a transportation route. It was the circulatory system of a state. When the river died, the state that depended on it weakened. And when the state weakened, the era of pyramid building ended. Not because people forgot how to build, because they lost the means to organise building on that scale. The pyramids are not monuments to brute force. They are monuments to organisation. And the Ahramat branch is the physical proof. Let yourself be taken somewhere new, somewhere quieter, older, more enclosed than the open desert. You are standing at the entrance to the Tura limestone quarries. They are on the eastern bank of the Nile, south of modern Cairo, cut into a ridge of pale, fine-grained Eocene limestone that has been prized by builders for 5,000 years. The entrance is dark and cool, a relief from the sun, and as you step inside, the air changes. It becomes damp and chalky, tasting of stone dust and deep earth. These quarries are not open pits. They are underground chambers, tunnels, rooms carved out of the living rock, their ceilings supported by pillars of uncut stone left standing like the columns of a cathedral. Some of these chambers are enormous. The walls are smooth where the blocks were removed, bearing the marks of copper tools and in places the faint traces of red ochre lines that quarrymen used to plan their cuts, a practice documented at multiple Egyptian quarry sites. The limestone here is special. It is not the rough, yellowish stone of the Giza plateau which was used for the core of the pyramids. Tura limestone is white, almost pure white, fine-grained and slightly translucent when cut thin. This is the stone that was used for the outer casing of the pyramids, the smooth, polished skin that made them shine like crystals in the desert light. When the Great Pyramid was new, it did not look the way it looks today, rough, stepped, weathered to a dusty gold. It was sheathed in a seamless coat of white Tura limestone, each block fitted so precisely to the next that the joints were nearly invisible. In sunlight the pyramid would have blazed. At dawn and dusk it would have glowed pink and amber and deep orange. At noon, under the Egyptian sun, it would have been almost too bright to look at. Almost all of that casing is gone now, stripped away over the centuries by later builders who valued the stone more than the monument. Only a few courses remain at the base of the Great Pyramid, and a larger section near the peak of Khafra's pyramid, where the casing stones were too high and too dangerous to remove. But in Mera's time, the casing was what made the pyramid a pyramid. The core was just structure. The skin was the meaning. Mera's job was to deliver that skin. The quarrying process itself was painstaking. Workers cut channels into the limestone along the planned dimensions of each block, using copper chisels and wooden mallets. Copper is a soft metal compared to iron or steel, but limestone is a relatively soft stone, and the chisels were constantly resharpened by teams of metal workers using whetstones and small forges. The copper for these tools came from the mines of the Sinai Peninsula, another link in the logistics chain, another resource delivered by boat. Once the channels were cut on three sides, the bottom of the block had to be freed. This was done by driving wooden wedges into a line of holes drilled along the base and then soaking the wedges with water. The wood expanded slowly, irresistibly. The stone cracked along the intended line. The block separated from the bedrock with a deep, quiet sound. Not a crack exactly, but a release, like something breathing out after holding its breath for a very long time. Each block was then levered out of the quarry face, tilted onto wooden rollers, and manoeuvred through the tunnels to the quarry entrance. From there, it was rolled down a ramp to the riverbank where the barges waited. This process was repeated thousands of times, tens of thousands of times. The Tura quarries are vast, miles of interconnected tunnels stretching deep into the limestone ridge. They were worked not just during the 4th dynasty, but for centuries before and centuries after, supplying stone for temples, tombs and palaces from the earliest dynasties through the Roman period. And every block that left Tura for the pyramid fields travelled by water, down the eastern bank to the main Nile, across or along the channel to the Ahramat branch, and up to the harbour at the base of whichever pyramid was under construction. Without the Ahramat branch, the casing stones could not have reached the pyramids. Without the casing stones, the pyramids would not have been what they were, not rough heaps of rough stone, but precisely finished, mathematically exact monuments that caught the light of the sun and held it. The river made the geometry possible. There is a name in Mera's logbook that deserves more attention, a man called Ankhaf. Mera mentioned him several times. Roshi Khufu, the mouth of the Lake of Khufu, was the harbour complex at Giza, the place where the boats arrived and the stone was unloaded, and Ankhaf was in charge of it. We know Ankhaf from other sources. He was Khufu's half-brother, a prince of the blood, a vizier, the highest administrative official in the Egyptian state, second only to the pharaoh himself. And based on the evidence from Mera's logbook, he was the man who oversaw the final stages of the Great Pyramid's construction, the project manager of the most famous building in the world. There is a bust of Ankhaf in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of Old Kingdom sculpture in existence, not because it is large or gilded or inscribed with elaborate titles, but because it is real. It looks like a person. The face is individualized, slightly fleshy. The eyes are set deep. The expression is watchful, intelligent, and slightly weary. It is the face of someone who has spent years managing the logistics of a construction project of unimaginable complexity, and who carries that weight in the lines around his mouth. This is the man who stood at the harbour when Mera's barge arrived, who counted the blocks, who signed the ledgers, who made sure the right stone went to the right place at the right time. The ancient Egyptian state was, above all, a bureaucracy. We sometimes think of ancient civilizations as simple, as if people who lived 5,000 years ago were somehow less capable of organizational complexity than people today. The evidence says otherwise. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri, not just Mera's logbook, but the accounting documents found alongside it, are structured like spreadsheets. Rows and columns, inputs and outputs, resources allocated, resources consumed, resources owing. The system tracked bread, beer, grain, meat, textiles. It tracked work hours and crew rotations. It tracked the movement of people across hundreds of miles. And it ran on water. The Aramat branch was not just a transportation route. It was the backbone of a communication and administrative network. Orders travelled by boat. Reports travelled by boat. Officials like Ankaf were stationed at key nodes in the system, the harbours, the quarries, the construction sites, and coordinated the flow of materials and labour through a bureaucracy that was, for its time, the most sophisticated on Earth. When you look at the Great Pyramid today and wonder how it was built, the answer is not mysterious. The answer is Ankaf. The answer is Mera. The answer is the thousands of named and unnamed officials, quarry workers, sailors, bakers, brewers, tool makers, record keepers, and labourers who were organised into teams, assigned specific tasks, fed regular meals, and kept on schedule by an administrative system that ran like a clock powered by a river. South of the Great Sphinx, about 400 metres from the edge of the pyramid complex, Mark Lehner's excavations have uncovered something that most visitors to Giza never see. It is not a tomb, not a temple, not a monument of any kind. It is something more important. It is a city. The lost city of the pyramids, or, as Lehner prefers to call it, the Hayt El Garab settlement, was a sprawling urban centre that housed, fed and administered the workforce that built the pyramids. At its peak, based on the scale of the bakeries, barracks, and food processing facilities uncovered so far, it may have supported 10 to 20,000 people, though estimates vary and much of the site remains unexcavated. Lehner has compared the total area to roughly 300 hectares, a scale comparable to the earliest known cities of Mesopotamia. The excavations have revealed barracks, long, narrow galleries where work crews slept in shifts, bakeries with enormous ceramic bread moulds, capable of producing thousands of loaves per day, breweries where beer, the staple drink of the Egyptian worker, was fermented in large vats, granaries for storing the grain that fed the population, fish processing facilities, copper workshops where tools were made and repaired, and there were houses, not just barracks, actual houses with rooms and courtyards for the officials and overseers who managed the project. The settlement had a clear hierarchy, reflected in the size and quality of the dwellings. The largest houses, some with multiple rooms, plastered walls and small gardens, belonged to the senior administrators. The barracks were for the rotating labour crews who came from across Egypt to work in shifts. The animal bones found at the site tell a revealing story. Cattle bones are abundant, particularly prime cuts, like those from the upper limbs. These workers were eating beef, not scraps, not offal, good meat, supplied by the state. Analysis of the faunal remains suggests that the livestock was driven to Giza from farms across the Nile Delta, another logistical operation that depended on transport networks, including the river. The bread, too, is revealing. Some of the bread moulds found at the site are large enough to produce loaves weighing several kilograms, far more than a single person would eat in a day. This suggests communal feeding, large-scale food production organised at a community level, distributed to work crews according to a schedule. Every aspect of this settlement points to the same conclusion. The pyramid building project was a national effort, not a local one, not an improvised one, a planned, funded, logistically supported national programme, drawing resources and labour from across the entire country and funneling them to the construction site through a network of waterways, of which the Aramat branch was the most critical. The workers who lived here were not prisoners. They were not slaves. The evidence from both the archaeological record and Mera's papyrus paints a picture of organised, compensated labour. Teams were rotated, injuries were treated, the dead were buried with care. workers' cemeteries near the site contain skeletons that show both healed fractures and the kind of degenerative conditions consistent with heavy physical labour, but also evidence of medical attention. These were people who gave their strength to the pyramid, and the river gave them the means to do it. Before the desert, there was rain. This is difficult to imagine standing at Giza today. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth, 9 million square kilometres of sand and rock and heat, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Red Sea. It is, in the modern world, the definition of barrenness. But it was not always so. Between approximately 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, during a period that climate scientists call the African Humid Period, or more poetically, the Green Sahara, the region that is now the Sahara Desert received significantly more rainfall than it does today. Lakes formed in what are now dry basins. Rivers flowed through what are now sand seas. Grasslands and savannas covered vast stretches of what is now the most inhospitable terrain on the continent. The evidence is extensive. Rock art in the Tassili Niger Mountains of southeastern Algeria, dating to roughly 6,000 years ago, depicts cattle, giraffes, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, and human figures swimming. Lake Chad, which today is a shrinking remnant of its former self, was once a vast inland sea, Mega-Chad, covering an area comparable to the Caspian Sea. Fossil pollen from sediment cores across the Sahara shows grasses, sedges, and even trees. This matters for the Aramat branch because the wetter climate of the early and middle Holocene is what created the conditions for the Nile's multiple branches. More rain in the Ethiopian highlands meant more water in the Nile system. More water meant more branches. More branches meant more habitable land along the western edge of the floodplain, land that later dried out and became the desert corridor where the pyramids now stand. The pyramid builders lived at the tail end of this wetter period. The fourth dynasty, the age of Khufu, Khafra and Menkaure, coincided with a Nile that was still relatively full, still sustaining multiple branches, still providing the water transport network that made large-scale construction possible. But the drying had already begun. The Sahara was advancing. The Green Sahara was becoming the Brown Sahara, and then the Yellow Sahara, and then the blinding, empty Sahara that we know. The pyramid builders may not have understood this in the way that we do. They did not have satellite imagery or climate models, but they were keen observers of the natural world. They measured the Nile flood every year with nilometers, stone-lined wells with graduated markings that track the water level. They noticed when the floods were high and when they were low. They recorded good years and bad years, and over the generations they would have noticed that the water was, on the whole, getting lower. The Aramat branch's decline was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow generational recession, a river that was, decade by decade, a little shallower, a little narrower, a little less reliable. The last pyramids built along its course are noticeably smaller and less ambitious than the first. This is usually attributed to political or economic decline, but it may also reflect a simple physical reality. The river could no longer carry what it once carried. The desert was patient. It waited for the water to leave, and then it moved in. The Ahramat branch is not the only lost river in the archaeological record, and this is where the story begins to open into something wider, something that connects the sands of Egypt to deserts and dried riverbeds across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in modern Iraq and Syria, archaeologists have long known that the ancient cities were built alongside channels and branches that no longer exist. The great city of Ur, once a thriving seaport, now lies hundreds of kilometres from the coast. The river moved. The city died. The ziggurat of Ur still stands, but the harbour it once overlooked is a featureless plain. At Tel Leilan, the Akkadian administrative centre in northeastern Syria that was abandoned during the 4.2 kiloyear drought, the evidence of sudden climate change is preserved in the soil itself. Excavations led by Harvey Weiss of Yale University revealed a layer of fine, wind-blown sand blanketing the ruins, the geological signature of a landscape drying out. Above that layer there is nothing, no pottery, no ash, no building, just sand and silence. The city had been a prosperous centre of perhaps 20,000 people, and then, within a generation or two, it was empty. In the Indus Valley, the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which some scholars identify with the legendary Sarasvati River of the Rig Veda, dried up in stages between roughly 2500 and 1500 BC. The great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which had thrived on its banks for centuries, declined and dispersed. Their sophisticated urban planning, grid-pattern streets, standardized brick construction, elaborate drainage systems could not survive the loss of the river that had made their agriculture and trade possible. The population moved east toward the Ganges basin, where the monsoons were more reliable. The cities they left behind were buried, their existence forgotten until Sir John Marshall's excavations in the 1920s brought them back to light. In China, the Liangzhu culture of the Yangtze Delta, known for its extraordinary jade artifacts and sophisticated water management, collapsed around 2300 BC, contemporaneous with the global drought event. There is a pattern here. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a coincidence. It is the simple, terrible fact that human civilizations are built on water, and water can leave. The 4.2 kilo-year event did not destroy these civilizations by itself. Political fragmentation, economic mismanagement, social inequality, these internal stresses made each society vulnerable. The drought did not cause the collapse. It exposed the fragility that was already there. But the river, always the river. Remove the river, and everything built beside it becomes untenable. This is the lesson the Ahrimat branch teaches if you are willing to learn it. Civilizations are not permanent. They are contingent. They depend on conditions that can change. And the conditions that matter most, water, climate, the health of the environment, are precisely the ones that human societies are most inclined to take for granted. Emin Ghanim's paper ends not with a conclusion, but with a beginning. The Ahrimat branch she and her co-authors suggest is one of at least several major extinct Nile branches that have not yet been fully mapped. The techniques that found the Ahrimat, radar satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, deep soil core analysis, can be applied across the entire Nile Valley and Delta, and each branch they find could reveal settlements, temples, cemeteries, and infrastructure that are currently invisible to archaeology. In the Delta alone, at least 5 of the 7 ancient Nile branches recorded by Ptolemy have never been fully traced. Their courses are estimated, approximated, argued about in academic papers, but their buried channels have not been systematically imaged. The Tanitic branch, the Pelusiac, the Sebennytic. Each one was, in its time, a highway of commerce and culture, lined with towns and temples. Each one silted up and disappeared, and each one left behind a geological ghost that modern technology can, in principle, detect. The implications are staggering. Egypt's Nile Delta is one of the most densely inhabited agricultural regions on Earth. Modern cities and farms sit on top of thousands of years of accumulated history, and much of that history, particularly from the early dynasties, when the Delta branches were most active, has never been excavated because no one knew precisely where to look. Ghanim's work provides a method: map the buried waterways, identify their banks, target excavations where the rivers once flowed. The settlements will be there. They have to be. You do not build a city away from water, but there is urgency in this. Egypt's population is growing. Its cities are expanding. Every year the floodplain is further developed. Roads, buildings, irrigation infrastructure. Each construction project potentially destroys what lies beneath. The race is not between archaeologists and the desert. The desert preserved these sites for millennia. The race is between archaeologists and development. As Ghanim herself noted, revealing these extinct Nile branches could help protect Egyptian cultural heritage by providing a more refined map of where ancient settlements are likely to lie, and preventing them from being lost to rapid urbanization before they are ever found. The Ahrimat branch is the proof of concept. It is the demonstration that this method works, and it is, almost certainly, just the first chapter of a much longer story. Consider what has already been found in similar circumstances elsewhere. The ancient harbour city of Thonis Herakleion, once one of Egypt's greatest ports, mentioned by Herodotus, associated with Helen of Troy in Greek legend, lay submerged beneath the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years before the underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio and his team located it in Abukir Bay in 2000. Its temples, its statues, its bronze coins and ceramic vessels, all preserved beneath the seabed. In 2019, divers found still more treasures there: the remains of a Greek temple, ancient granite columns, ships still laden with cargo. Herakleion was not buried by sand, it was buried by water. A series of earthquakes and tidal waves caused the ground beneath the city to liquefy, and the Mediterranean moved in. A different kind of disappearance, but the same lesson. The past does not announce when it is leaving. It simply goes. The Ahrimat branch went the same way, quietly, gradually, over centuries, and it took with it whatever was built along its banks. Those sites are still there, waiting. The question is whether we will find them before the 21st century builds over them. Imagine standing at Giza after dark. No tourists, no lights, just the pyramids and the stars and the silence of the western desert. The temperature drops quickly in the desert after sundown. The stone of the pyramids, which absorbed the sun's heat all day, begins to radiate it back into the cool night air. If you place your hand on the limestone, it is warm, like touching something alive. The stars here are different from the stars you see in most places. The desert air is dry, and the sky's clear, and the Milky Way arches overhead in a thick, luminous band. Some scholars believe the ancient Egyptians saw this river of stars as a heavenly counterpart to the Nile below, a celestial waterway mirroring the earthly one. A hymn from the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten references quote, _0, __, and recent research by astrophysicist Or Gra at the University of Portsmouth has linked the Milky Way to the sky goddess Nut, whose star-covered body was depicted arching over the earth on coffin lids for thousands of years. Whether the Egyptians saw the Milky Way as Nut herself, or as a river flowing through her, the connection between the stars above and the water below was woven deep into their understanding of the cosmos. Deep beneath your feet, roughly 25 meters down based on the core samples, the sediment of the Ahrimat branch is still there. Silt and sand, compressed by the weight of centuries, still holding the faint chemical traces of the water that once flowed through it. Pollen from marsh plants. The signatures of an aquatic ecosystem that sustained a civilization. The ancient Egyptians called the Nile Iteru, simply quote one. It was not one river among many to them. It was the river, the source of life, the highway of gods, the border between the living and the dead. Every temple in Egypt was oriented toward the Nile. Every city was built along it. Every funeral procession ended at its banks. The western bank, the side of the setting sun, was the side of death, the side of the cemeteries and the tombs and the pyramids. The eastern bank was the side of the living, of homes and markets and labour. The Ahrimat branch was part of this sacred geography. The pyramid builders did not merely use the river for logistics, they embedded it in their theology. The valley temple at the water's edge was the threshold between worlds. The causeway was the passage from life to eternity. The pyramid was the final destination, the point where earth met sky, where the pharaoh's body rested and his spirit ascended. When the river left, the theology remained. The causeway still pointed downhill, the valley temples still faced west, but the water was gone, and the meaning of the architecture slowly became opaque, like a sentence in a language no one speaks anymore. Ghanim's discovery gives us the dictionary back. If you ever visit Giza, and perhaps you have, or perhaps you will, or perhaps you will only ever visit it this way, through words, in the dark, there is something most people miss. The tourists come for the pyramids. They look up, they take photographs, they marvel at the scale, and then they leave. Most of them never walk the causeways. The causeways are the long, sloping pathways that connect the valley temples to the mortuary temples, and from there to the pyramids themselves. They are ruined now, their walls reduced to low ridges of rubble, their ceilings long gone, their decorations stripped or weathered to nothing. In their current state they look like paths, like wide ancient sidewalks leading uphill. But they were not paths, they were tunnels, enclosed corridors walled and roofed, their interiors decorated with painted reliefs depicting the achievements of the pharaoh, the offerings of the gods, the procession of eternity. Some causeways were nearly a kilometre long. Khufu's causeway, according to the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Giza when the complex was already 2,000 years old, was, by his account, one of the most impressive structures at the site. He described it as being built of polished stone, decorated with carvings of animals and taking 10 years to build. Whether Herodotus was describing the causeway as it actually appeared in his time, or relaying a traditional account that had been embellished by Egyptian priests remains an open question. Today, only fragments of Khufu's causeway survive. Unis's causeway at Saqqara is better preserved, and its interior walls still bear some of the most haunting relief carvings in all of Egyptian art. Scenes of famine, scenes of foreign peoples bringing tribute, scenes of daily life, of agriculture, of boats on the river, boats on the river. The causeways were, physically and symbolically, bridges between two worlds. The world of the water, the valley temple, the harbour, the boats, the commerce of the living, and the world of the stone, the mortuary temple, the pyramid, the silence of the dead. To walk the causeway was to pass from one state of being to another, from life to eternity, from the river to the desert. And the angle of the causeway, each one built perpendicular to the Ahrimat branch, sloping upward from the riverbank to the pyramid, was the angle of that passage, the inclination of transition, a ramp between two realities. Without the river, the causeway is just a path uphill. With the river, it is one of the most profound architectural statements in the history of human civilization, a built corridor between the living and the dead, between the water that sustains life and the stone that endures beyond it. In the 5th century BC, roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, and 2,500 years before you are hearing this story, a Greek traveller named Herodotus visited Egypt. He was curious, relentlessly, almost annoyingly curious. He asked questions everywhere he went. He talked to priests and farmers and merchants and officials. He wrote down what they told him, and he wrote down what he saw, and he published it all in a work called the Histories, one of the foundational texts of Western civilization. He is sometimes called the father of history. He is also sometimes called the father of lies, because not everything he reported was accurate. But he tried. He tried harder than almost anyone in the ancient world to understand what he was looking at. When Herodotus visited Giza, the pyramids were ancient, already weathered, already mysterious, already the subject of legend and speculation. And yet, crucially, the landscape around them was not the landscape you see today. Herodotus appears to describe, in passages that scholars have debated for centuries, the Nile flooding up to the vicinity of the pyramids. He mentions what seems to be a functioning canal system near the pyramid complex. The exact meaning of his words is contested. His Greek can be read in more than one way, and he was writing about a landscape already 2 millennia removed from the age of the pyramid builders. But the general picture, as many Egyptologists interpret it, is consistent. In Herodotus's time, there was still some kind of water connection between the Nile and the Giza area. Was this the Ahrimat branch? Probably not. By the 5th century BC, the Ahrimat branch had likely been dry for at least 1,500 years. But other waterways, canals, secondary channels, seasonal flood extensions may have still connected the Nile to the western plateau. The landscape was not yet the fully arid desert it would become. What Herodotus saw was a landscape in transition, a landscape where the memory of water was still partially visible, in the canals, in the valley temples, in the physical logic of the architecture. He did not know the full story. He could not have known. The Ahrimat branch was already a ghost, buried beneath centuries of silt and sand. But its effects lingered in the infrastructure, in the orientation of the buildings, in the fading channels that still carried floodwater to the base of the plateau during the annual inundation. Herodotus asked the priests how the pyramids were built. They told him stories. Some were probably true, some were probably embellished. He wrote them all down, and scholars have been arguing about them ever since. What Herodotus could not ask, because the knowledge had already been lost, was where the river went. The river that carried the stone and the workers and the food and the cedar and the copper. The river that Inspector Mira sailed, that Ankaf supervised, that the quarry workers at Tura depended on. That river was already forgotten, and it would remain forgotten for another 24 centuries. Before Cairo, there was Memphis. Memphis was the capital of the Old Kingdom, the administrative centre from which the pyramid-building pharaohs governed all of Egypt. It was located roughly 20 kilometres south of modern Cairo, at the apex of the Nile Delta, where the river begins to fan out into its branching distributaries. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the most important city in the ancient world. Today, almost nothing remains of Memphis above ground. A few colossal statues, a small open-air museum, the ruins of a temple. The site is surrounded by palm groves and agricultural fields, and the modern village of Mitrahina covers much of the ancient city. But the choice of Memphis as a capital was not arbitrary. It was strategic. Memphis sat at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, the point where the narrow Nile Valley of the south opened into the broad branching delta of the north. Controlling Memphis meant controlling the river, Controlling the river meant controlling everything, and the Aramat branch, based on Ghonem's mapping, would have been one of the waterways that Memphis controlled. The branch ran along the western edge of the floodplain, past the pyramid fields of Saqqara and Dashur, which are essentially the necropolis, the city of the dead, associated with Memphis. The living city was on the floodplain, the dead were on the desert edge, at the foot of the western plateau, and the river, the Aramat branch, flowed between them. This proximity suggests a relationship that was both practical and sacred. This geography, if we follow the implications of Ghonem's work, gives us a deeper understanding of the relationship between Memphis and its pyramids. The necropolis was not separate from the city. It was connected to it by water. Officials and priests and workers travelled by boat from the living city to the construction sites and temple complexes along the western bank. Stone and supplies flowed in the same direction. The Aramat branch was the umbilical cord between the world of governance and the world of monument building. When the river died, Memphis did not die immediately. The city persisted as a capital and cultural centre for centuries, eventually declining during the first millennium BC as other cities, Thebes, Sai, Alexandria, rose in prominence. But the relationship between Memphis and its necropolis was fundamentally altered. The convenient water highway that had once connected the living city to the western plateau was gone. The pyramids became more remote, more isolated, more mysterious, and eventually even Memphis itself was buried. Consumed by the silt of the Nile, covered by the slow accumulation of agricultural soil, its stones scavenged for later building projects, its streets and temples and palaces sinking beneath the surface, till only a few colossal fragments protruded from the earth. 2 burials, then. The river and the city, both buried by the land they helped to shape, both waiting, patient beneath the soil of modern Egypt. Close your eyes tighter. Not because you need to see, you don't, but because the next part of this story is best experienced in the dark. Imagine the sound of the Ahramat branch, not the roar of rapids. The Ahramat was not that kind of river. It was a Nile branch, broad, slow, deep, carrying the heavy silence of fertile water through a floodplain of reeds and marsh and dark, silty earth. The sound would have been more murmur than song, the quiet lapping of water against muddy banks, the occasional splash of a crocodile sliding into the current, the distant honking of geese in the marshes, the creak of a barge's cedar hull as it shifted in the current. At dawn, the water would have been still, fog rising from the surface in the cooler months of November, December, January, when the Egyptian morning can be surprisingly cold. The Nile mist would have hung over the Ahramat branch like a veil, softening the outlines of the boats docked at the harbour, muting the sounds of the workers beginning their day. Then the sun, climbing from the eastern desert, flooding the floodplain with a light that turned the water from grey to gold to pale, blinding white. The mist would burn off quickly, the air would warm, and the boats would cast off, their crews calling to each other, their oars dipping into the water, their square sails catching the north wind if they were heading south, or furling and drifting with the current if heading north. The smell of the river. This is harder to imagine, because our modern noses are not calibrated for ancient water, but the Nile in the Old Kingdom, before dams and irrigation canals and modern agriculture, was a different thing from the Nile today. It was a wild river. It flooded annually, laying down a thick layer of black silt, the Kemet, the Black Land, from which Egypt took its ancient name. The silt smelled of earth, rich, dark, organic, the smell of fertility, the smell of the beginning of things, mixed with that, the smell of bitumen and resin from the boats' hulls, the smell of fresh-cut limestone dust blowing from the quarries across the water, the smell of bread baking in the workers' kitchens, the smell of cattle, the smell of beer fermenting in clay vats. This was not a silent world, not an empty world, not the museum-piece silence of a modern archaeological site. This was a living, noisy, productive world, as complex and as human as any waterfront city in history. Dock workers and sailors and bureaucrats and priests and quarry workers and bakers and brewers and tool makers, all moving along the banks of a river that was the centre of their world. And that world is gone now, entirely gone. Not a single note of its sound survives. Not a single molecule of its smell. Only the stone, only the papyrus, only the ghost of the river written in sediment deep below the sand. But if you are very quiet, If you let the story carry you far enough, you might hear it. The faint, distant murmur of water that is no longer there. Here is something worth saying plainly, while the night is quiet and there are no arguments to win. The pyramids were not built by aliens. They were not built by a lost civilization. They were not built using forgotten technology or supernatural powers or any of the other explanations that flourish in the absence of evidence and the presence of wonder. They were built by people. Specific, named, historically documented people. Inspector Mera and his crew of 40 men. The noble Ankaf and his administrative staff. The quarry workers at Tura and Aswan. The bakers and brewers of the workers' city at Giza. The boat builders who shaped Lebanese cedar into cargo barges. The surveyors who laid out the pyramid's base to within centimetres of perfect. The scribes who kept the accounts. The doctors who set broken bones. These were not simple people doing simple work. They were some of the most skilled, organised and dedicated workers in the history of civilization, and they had something that popular imagination has long denied them, a river. The mystery of the pyramids was never really about the stones. It was about the logistics. How do you move millions of tons of material across miles of terrain and stack them, precisely, into the most geometrically exact structures of the ancient world? The answer, as the Aramat branch makes clear, is you don't. You don't move them across miles of terrain. You float them across miles of water, and then you move them a few hundred metres up a causeway. The river transforms the problem. It reduces it from the apparently impossible to the merely extraordinary. Still extraordinary. Still a feat of organisation and engineering that few civilizations in history could have attempted, let alone accomplished. But comprehensible, human, achievable by people who had mastered the physics of water, the chemistry of copper, the geometry of stone, and the art of feeding 20,000 people in the middle of a desert. The mystery was never the building, the mystery was the river, and now the river has been found. In 1954, an Egyptian archaeologist named Kamal el-Malakh was excavating near the southern face of the Great Pyramid when he noticed something unusual in the bedrock, a sealed pit, covered by massive limestone slabs, each weighing several tons, fitted together with gypsum mortar and stamped with the cartouche of Khufu. When the first slab was lifted, El-Malakh smelled cedar. After 4,500 years, the wood inside was still fragrant. What he had found was a ship. Not a model, not a fragment, an entire full-size vessel, disassembled into 1,224 pieces and laid in the pit in careful, logical order as if waiting to be rebuilt. And it was rebuilt, over the course of more than a decade, by the master restorer Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, who taught himself ancient Egyptian boat-building techniques by studying tomb reliefs and visiting the traditional boatyards of the Nile. The reassembled Khufu ship is 43.5 metres long, nearly 6 metres wide, built almost entirely of Lebanese cedar, the same wood that, based on what we know of Old Kingdom shipbuilding, was likely used for the cargo barges of Mera's era. Its planks are joined not with nails but with mortise and tenon joints and rope lashings. It has a flat bottom, no keel, and a graceful papyriform shape, its bow and stern curving upward in imitation of the bundle papyrus boats that had been used on the Nile since prehistory. The ship was moved to the Grand Egyptian Museum in August 2021. It remains the oldest intact ship ever discovered, and it has been described by those who have studied it closely as a masterpiece of woodcraft that could sail today if placed in water. Whether the Khufu ship was ever actually used on the Nile is debated. Some scholars believe it was purely ceremonial, a solar barge, intended to carry the pharaoh's spirit across the heavens in the company of the sun god Ra. Others note subtle signs of possible water use, where marks on the hull, traces that could indicate contact with water. If it did serve as the funerary barge that carried Khufu's body from the living city of Memphis across the water to the Valley Temple at the base of his pyramid, then its last voyage would have been along the Aramat branch, the same river that Mera sailed, the same waterway that connected the living and the dead. This remains, it should be said, an inference. We cannot know for certain whether this particular ship touched the water of the Aramat branch, but the river was there, the harbour was there, and the ship was built to float. The ship is silent now, museum still, but close your eyes and imagine it on the water. The cedar hull cutting through the slow current of the Ahramat branch, the oarsmen pulling in rhythm, the royal canopy at the stern shading the coffin of the pharaoh, the priests chanting, the mourners wailing softly from the banks, the causeway ahead, rising from the water's edge to the pyramid on the plateau, the last journey. The river giving up its cargo for the final time, and then the ship was disassembled. Piece by piece, its planks were numbered and lowered into the pit beside the pyramid. The limestone slabs were fitted over the top. The gypsum was sealed. 4,500 years of silence, until the smell of cedar drifting up from the opened stone told the world what had been waiting underneath. The logbook ends. It does not end dramatically. It does not end with a conclusion or a farewell. It simply stops, the way a work diary stops when the work is done. Mera's last recorded entries describe the same rhythm as his first: loading stone, sailing to Giza, unloading, sailing back. The days blur together. The work continues. There is no indication that Mera knew he was living at the end of an era, that Khufu was aging, that the great building project was nearing completion, that the harbour at Wadi al-Jarf would soon be closed and his papyrus would be stuffed between limestone blocks and forgotten for 45 centuries. Pierre Tallet believes the papyrus was left behind when the harbour was decommissioned, probably around the time of Khufu's death. A team was sent from Giza to seal the storage galleries, the man-made caves cut into the limestone cliffs above the Red Sea shore, where the boats and their equipment were kept. They were known as the escort team of the Uraeus of Khufu as its prow. During the process of blocking up the galleries with massive stone slabs, Mera's records, along with accounting documents, crew lists, and other administrative papyri, became lodged between the stones, wedged there, sealed there, protected by the dry desert air from the moisture and insects that would have destroyed them anywhere else in Egypt. And there they stayed, for 4,500 years, while the pyramid aged and lost its casing, while the river silted up and vanished, while Memphis declined and Cairo rose, and the Arab conquest came, and the Mamluks ruled, and Napoleon's army measured the Sphinx, and Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, and the modern world looked at the pyramids and wondered how and why and who. All that time, Mera's logbook was there, pressed between stones in a cave on the Red Sea coast, waiting. In 2008, Pierre Tallet, following leads from an earlier interrupted survey by two French pilots in the 1950s, began excavating the harbour complex at Wadi al-Jarf. He identified it as a 4th Dynasty facility: storage galleries cut into the bedrock, stone jetties, ceramic jars bearing the name of Khufu. And then, on March 24, 2013, near the entrance to one of the storage galleries, he found the first fragments of papyrus. 10 days later, between the ceiling blocks of another gallery, he found hundreds more. It took years to unfold, catalogue and translate the fragments. Many were damaged, many were incomplete. But the best preserved sections, Papyri A and B, told a story so specific, so detailed, so profoundly ordinary in its bureaucratic precision, that it transformed our understanding of the Great Pyramid. A man, a boat, a river, stone. That is all it was, and it was everything. Let yourself arrive here slowly. There is no rush. There has never been a rush, not in this story, not tonight. The air is very still now. The stars have moved. The desert has that quality it gets in the deep hours, not empty, but held, as if something vast and very quiet is paying attention. Somewhere beneath the Sahara, deep down, the sediment of the Ahramat branch is still there. Fine sand, river silt, the compressed memory of a waterway that once carried the stones that built the pyramids. It does not move, it does not change, it simply waits, as it has waited for 4,000 years, for someone to find it and understand what it means. And understanding is itself a kind of archaeology. It takes time, it requires patience. The Ahramat branch was suspected long before it was proven. Archaeologists had noticed the alignment of the causeways. They had puzzled over the valley temples facing empty desert. They had read Mera's logbook and wondered where his river went. For decades, the pieces of the puzzle were scattered across different disciplines: Egyptology, geology, remote sensing, papyrology, and no one had assembled them into a single picture. It took a geomorphologist who grew up in Egypt, studying the shape of landscapes, to see what had been hiding in plain sight. Inspector Mera sailed this river. He did not think of it as remarkable. It was just the river, the way to work, the water that carried his boat and his crew and his stones from one place to another. He wrote his logbook the way any working person writes a timesheet, dutifully, without poetry, recording what happened and when. Cast off from Tura, loaded with stone, spent the night at the Lake of Khufu, he could not have known that his logbook would survive. He could not have known that the river he sailed on would vanish. He could not have known that 45 centuries later, a woman from his own country would find the ghost of his waterway using technology he could not have imagined, and that her discovery would finally explain the mystery that his logbook had always implied. Mera and Ghonim, two Egyptians, 4,500 years apart, both telling the same story, the story of a river. Before the story closes, before the night takes it, think about this. Every great civilization in human history began beside water. Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, Egypt, the Nile, the Indus Valley, the Indus and the Gaga Hakra, China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze, Rome, the Tiber, London, the Thames. We build beside water because water is life. It is food and transport and sanitation and trade. It is the foundation on which everything else rests. And yet, and this is the strange, the haunting thing, we rarely think about it. Water is so fundamental that it becomes invisible. It becomes background. We take it for granted the way we take the ground beneath our feet for granted. The ancient Egyptians did not take the Nile for granted. They measured it. They worshipped it. They personified it as Hapi, a benevolent deity with a protruding belly, the god of abundance, of the annual flood, of the fertile black soil that made agriculture possible. They built nilometers, graduated measuring wells, at key points along the river, and they recorded the height of each year's flood with the same care that a modern financial institution records its earnings. Too little flood meant famine. Too much flood meant destruction. The perfect flood, the one that left just enough water and just enough silt, was a gift from the gods. And the Ahrimat branch was part of this system, a major branch of the sacred river, flowing past the most sacred sites in the kingdom, carrying the stone and the labour and the ritual that connected the world of the living to the world of the dead. When that branch dried up, when the 4.2 kiloyear drought slowly choked it with sand and reduced its flow to a trickle, and then to nothing, it was not just a logistical inconvenience. Based on what we know of Egyptian religious thought, it may well have been experienced as a theological crisis. The river was supposed to be eternal. The flood was supposed to return every year. The gods were supposed to provide. And yet, the water left. The first intermediate period, the era of fragmentation and famine that followed the Old Kingdom's collapse, was not just a political crisis. Some scholars have argued that it was also a crisis of faith. If the gods controlled the river, and the river was failing, then either the gods had abandoned Egypt or the pharaoh had failed to please them. The textual evidence from the period, famine inscriptions, laments, pessimistic literature, suggests a society grappling with profound uncertainty about the order of things. The pyramids stopped being built at the monumental scale of the Fourth Dynasty, not because the technology was lost, not because the knowledge disappeared, but because the system that made them possible, the river, the logistics, the centralized state, the theological confidence, had been undermined by environmental change. The stones remained, the river did not. And tonight, 4,000 years later, you are lying in the dark listening to the story of both, the stones and the water, the things that endure and the things that vanish, the monuments we build and the conditions that make them possible, conditions that we did not create, that we cannot control. What survives? It is worth asking, not in an academic way, in a human way, in the way you think about things when the house is quiet and the world is small, and the questions that feel too large for daylight suddenly feel like exactly the right size. Mera's logbook survived because it was sealed in a dry cave. The pyramids survived because they are stone. The Ahrimat branch survived as a ghost in the sediment, readable only by radar. But what about the rest? The names of the quarry workers, the songs the sailors sang on the river, the prayers the priests spoke in the valley temples, the lullabies the workers' wives sang to their children in the barracks at the foot of the plateau, the arguments and the jokes and the fears and the hopes of 20,000 people who lived and worked and died in the service of a monument that would outlast them by millennia. All of that is gone, not buried, not waiting to be found. Gone, dissolved into the air and the soil and the silence of 4,000 years. What we know about the past is a fraction of what existed. The archaeological record is not a history, it is a survival, a thin scattering of objects and texts that happened, by accident or design, to resist the ordinary processes of decay. For every papyrus that survived in a dry cave, 1,000 were eaten by insects or dissolved in the damp soil of the floodplain. For every stone temple that stands, 100 wooden structures rotted to nothing. For every name we know, Mera, Ankaf, Khufu, Gonim, there are 1,000,000 names we will never know. This is not a tragedy, it is a fact, and it is worth sitting with, quietly, in the dark. Because it changes the way you think about discovery. When Emangonim found the Ahramat branch, she did not just add a fact to the historical record, she recovered a piece of a world that had been lost. She made something that was invisible visible again. She gave back to 4,000 years of silence a voice. And that is what archaeology does, at its best. Not answer questions, not solve mysteries, but listen. Listen to the ground. Listen to the sediment. Listen to the stone. And then, carefully, patiently, translate what the ground is saying into language that living people can understand. The Ahramat branch was always there. The evidence was always there. The causeways pointed at it. The valley temples faced it. The logbook described it. But no one had the tools to hear what the ground was saying until radar made the invisible visible, and a geomorphologist from Egypt asked the right question. What else is the ground saying that we have not yet learned to hear? One last image, one last thought, then rest. The ancient Egyptians looked up at the Milky Way and, based on what we can piece together from their art and texts, appear to have seen something like a river. Recent scholarship suggests they associated it with the sky goddess Nut, whose star-studded body arched across the heavens on hundreds of coffin paintings. A hymn from the Amarna period speaks of a Nile in the sky. Whether they understood the Milky Way as a literal celestial river, or as the luminous body of a goddess who swallowed the sun each evening and gave birth to it each dawn, the connection between their earthly water and the band of stars overhead seems to have run deep in their cosmology. The Ahramat branch flowed from south to north, roughly parallel to the main Nile, carrying stone and workers and grain toward the pyramid fields. Above it, for those who understood the night sky as the Egyptians did, the Milky Way arched from horizon to horizon, the luminous body of Nut, or a celestial river, or both at once, carrying the souls of pharaohs toward the imperishable stars. 2 rivers, or what the Egyptians may have understood as 2 rivers, one below, one above, one made of water, one made of light. The water is gone now, but the light remains. If you step outside tonight, or if you close your eyes and imagine stepping outside into a desert without cities, without streetlights, without the haze of the modern world, the Milky Way is still there, still arching, still flowing. The same band of stars that the pyramid builders saw when they looked up from the banks of the Ahramat branch 45 centuries ago. They were not wrong. The stars are there, the path is there. What is gone is only the water, only the river beneath the river of light. But now you know it was there. You know its name, you know its shape, you know its length, 64 kilometers, and its width, 200 to 700 meters, and its depth, 2 to 8 meters. You know it carried limestone from Tura and granite from Aswan and cedar from Lebanon, and bread and beer and cattle and workers from across the kingdom. You know that a man named Mera sailed it, and that a woman named Gonim found it, and that between them stretches a silence of 4,500 years that has finally quietly been broken. It is late now. The desert is very still. Let the story loosen. Let the facts settle like sediment in slow water. What does it mean? Not scientifically, not archaeologically, but humanly. That a 64-kilometre river can vanish so completely that no one finds it for 4,000 years. It means that forgetting is natural, not failure, not tragedy, just the way things work. The land covers what the land covers. The sand fills what it fills. The living build over the dead, and the living after them build over that, and the layers accumulate until the original ground is buried so deep that only radar can find it. Every civilization in human history has experienced this. The cities of Mesopotamia, Uruk, Nineveh, lay buried beneath mounds of earth for millennia before archaeologists dug them out. The Indus Valley cities were forgotten entirely until the 1920s. Troy was a myth until Heinrich Schliemann found it. Pompeii was a field of grass. We think of the past as something preserved. It is not. It is something lost. What survives is the exception. The pyramids survive because they are made of 2 million blocks of stone and are the size of mountains. The papyrus of Inspector Mira survives because it was sealed in a dry cave on the Red Sea coast, protected from moisture and insects and time. The Ahrimat branch survives, barely, as a ghost in the sediment, readable only by machines that did not exist until the 21st century. Everything else is gone. And yet, here you are, lying in the dark, listening to a story about a man named Mera who loaded stones onto a boat 45 centuries ago and sailed them down a river that no longer exists to build a monument that still stands. His logbook survived. His name survived. The rhythm of his days, cast off from Tura in the morning, spend the night at the Lake of Khufu, sail back the next day, survives in enough detail that you can almost hear the creak of the cedar hull, and the splash of the oars, and the quiet murmur of 40 men settling in for the night beside the loading docks at the foot of the greatest construction site the ancient world ever knew. That is remarkable. That is, in its own quiet way, miraculous. Not because it involves divine intervention or alien technology, or any of the other explanations that people reach for when the real story seems too ordinary to account for what was built, but because it shows what human beings actually are. Patient, organised, determined, capable of sustaining a vision over decades, of coordinating thousands of people across hundreds of miles, of turning water and wood and stone and human labour into something that will still be standing when the river that built it has been forgotten for 4,000 years. There is one more thing the research suggests, and it is worth holding in your mind as you drift. The Ahrimat branch is gone, the water left, but the patterns it created, the logic of the landscape, the way the pyramids are oriented, the angles of the causeways, the placement of the temples remain legible. The river is gone, but its influence is permanent. It shaped the geography of one of the greatest civilizations in history, and that shaping outlasted the water itself. There is a concept in geology called palimpsest landscape, a landscape where the features created by one set of conditions remain visible even after those conditions have changed. The valley temples still face the vanished waterline. The causeways still slope toward a harbour that no longer exists. The pyramid chain still follows the course of a river that has been buried for 4 millennia. The land remembers the water, even when the water forgets the land. And now we remember it too. In May of 2024, for the first time in 4,000 years, the Ahrimat branch was named, mapped, published. It exists again, not as a flowing river, but as knowledge, as data, as a story that connects Inspector Mera's logbook to Iman Ghonem's radar scans across 45 centuries of silence. The river is back, not literally, but in the way that matters most for a creature that lives by storytelling. It is back in human awareness. It is part of the conversation again. And the conversation is just beginning. Ghonem's team has stated that future research could identify further buried channels. Each discovery could reshape what we know about Egyptian history from the ground up. We have been studying Egypt for 2 centuries. We have catalogued its temples and translated its hieroglyphs and mapped its tombs. And yet, until 2024, we did not know that the most important highway in the pyramid builders' world was buried deep beneath the sand we were standing on. What else don't we know? What other rivers, in what other deserts, in what other parts of the world are lying beneath our feet? Patient, silent, holding secrets that we have not yet learned to ask about. Now, before you drift off, let me leave you with one question. If a 64-kilometre river can disappear completely beneath the desert, buried so deep that no one found it for 4,000 years, what else do you think is hidden beneath the ground we walk on every day? Tell me in the comments. The most interesting answers always come from this kind of question. And if this story stayed with you, if it pulled you along even a little, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like. It helps other people find this channel, and it helps me keep making these stories for you. If you want to keep going, if the night is still long and you're not quite ready to let the ancient world go, there are more stories waiting in the playlist. They'll be here when you need them. The desert is not empty. It never was. It simply remembers differently than we do. The stones remember in their silence. The sediment remembers in its layers. The The causeways remember in their angles, still pointing toward a harbour that filled with sand before Rome was founded, before Athens was built, before the first word of the Bible was written. And somewhere, in a museum case in Cairo, a piece of papyrus the size of a human hand still carries the handwriting of a man who loaded stones onto a boat and sailed them down a river that the world forgot. He wrote in hieratic, the everyday cursive of ancient Egypt. Quick, efficient strokes, not art, just record-keeping. The kind of writing you do when you have work to finish and stones to deliver, and a long day on the water behind you. Day 25. Inspector Mera spends the day with his crew hauling stones in Tura South. Spends the night at Tura South. Day 26. Inspector Mera casts off from Tura South, loaded with stone, for the horizon of Khufu. Spends the night at the Lake of Khufu. Day 27. Sets sail from the Lake of Khufu. Sails toward the horizon of Khufu loaded with stone. Spends the night at the horizon of Khufu. Day 28. Casts off from the horizon of Khufu in the morning. Sails upriver toward Tura South. And again, load the stone, sail the river, unload, sail back, the rhythm of it, the quiet, patient rhythm, like breathing, like the tide, like the kind of work that builds something that will stand for 5,000 years. Rest, now. The river has carried everything it needed to carry. The stones are in place, the pyramid stands, and the desert, patient beyond all human measure, has kept its secret for long enough. It can wait a little longer. Till next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.